They promise sweet dreams and deliver the sleep you never wake up from. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the pills that promise sweet dreams and deliver death. Barbiturates killed Marilyn Monroe with the same efficiency they once cured insomnia, which is the kind of irony that makes you wonder if modern medicine was just very slow murder with a prescription pad. These drugs were supposed to be humanity's answer to sleepless nights and frayed nerves, yet they turned Hollywood bedrooms into crime scenes and made accidental overdose the most popular euphemism of the 20th century. The sleep aid became the suicide method of choice. What was marketed as safer than alcohol destroyed more lives than bootleg whiskey ever managed. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how barbiturates became America's favourite killer, you first need to understand that they were born from a celebration. Adolf von Baeyer, a German chemist with the kind of surname that sounds like a villain's, even when you're not looking for symbolism, synthesized the first barbiturate on December 4th, 1864. The date mattered because it was St. Barbara's Day, and Baeyer apparently had enough religious sentiment to name his new compound after the patron saint of artillerymen and a good death. He combined uric acid from kidney stones with malonic acid in his laboratory, creating a substance that would eventually put more people to sleep than all the lullabies ever written. The compound itself was barbituric acid, chemically inert and medically useless, but it laid the groundwork for derivatives that would change psychiatry, anesthesiology, and the art of dying in your sleep. Baeyer didn't immediately realize what he'd created. Scientists rarely do. He was more interested in dyes at the time, industrial chemistry being far more profitable than the business of human consciousness. The barbituric acid sat in his notes like a seed waiting for rain. 30 years passed before two other German chemists, Emil Fischer and Joseph von Mehring, took Bayer's base compound and turned it into something that could actually affect the human brain. They synthesized diethylbarbituric acid in 1903 and called it Barbital. The trade name was Veronal, chosen because Fischer had visited the Italian city of Verona and apparently associated it with peace and tranquility, which shows you how effectively a nice vacation can cloud scientific judgment. Veronal hit the market like a revelation from a merciful god. Insomnia, which had plagued humanity since we developed enough consciousness to worry about tomorrow, finally had a chemical solution. Anxiety could be dampened, seizures could be controlled. The drug worked by enhancing the effect of GABA, a neurotransmitter that tells your brain to calm down, essentially acting like a dimmer switch for consciousness. Imagine your nervous system as a restaurant full of screaming customers, and barbiturates are the manager who tells everyone to lower their voices or get out. The drug binds to GABA receptors and makes them more sensitive to the brain's natural calming chemicals, slowing neural transmission until thoughts become sluggish, muscles relax, and eventually consciousness simply switches off. It was elegant. It was effective. It was everything medicine had been searching for. Doctors prescribed Veronal with the enthusiasm of missionaries distributing Bibles. Here was a drug that worked every single time, unlike the opium-based remedies that turned patients into addicts, or the bromides that caused psychosis after extended use. Barbital was synthesized in a laboratory, which gave it the legitimacy of modern science rather than the suspect pedigree of plant-derived narcotics. Pharmaceutical companies in Germany and America immediately understood they'd found something revolutionary. The modern world was creating modern problems, industrial noise, electric lights disrupting natural sleep cycles, the psychological pressure of urban life, and barbiturates were the modern solution. Physicians wrote prescriptions for sleeplessness, for anxiety, for the general condition of being alive in the 20th century and finding it overwhelming. the drug spread across Europe faster than influenza. By 1906, doctors in Paris, London, Berlin and Vienna were prescribing barbiturates to aristocrats who couldn't sleep in their mansions, and factory workers who couldn't sleep in their tenements. Insomnia, it turned out, was democratically distributed. The pills worked regardless of social class, offering the same dreamless void to duchesses and dock workers alike. American physicians adopted barbiturates with equal fervour, seeing them as proof that the United States could match European pharmaceutical innovation. The drug represented progress, the triumph of chemistry over the messy unpredictability of human neurology. Nobody asked the obvious questions. Nobody wondered what happens when you give millions of people access to a drug that shuts down their central nervous system. The medical establishment was too busy celebrating its victory over sleeplessness to consider whether the cure might be worse than the condition. Pharmaceutical companies certainly weren't interested in examining potential problems when they were making fortunes selling Veronal in bottles that looked like they contained holy water rather than synthetic sedation. The early medical journals published glowing reports: patients sleeping through the night, anxiety disappearing, epileptics experiencing fewer seizures. Success stories accumulated like evidence in a trial where the defense never showed up. Then the first death occurred, though nobody paid much attention. A woman in Munich took too much Veronal in 1907 and never woke up. The doctors called it an accident, a miscalculation of dosage, a tragic but isolated incident. They were catastrophically wrong, but catastrophes have a way of disguising themselves as anomalies until the body count becomes undeniable. More deaths followed in 1908, then 1909, a slow trickle that physicians attributed to patient error rather than pharmaceutical danger. The drug itself remained above suspicion because it worked exactly as advertised. It put people to sleep. Sometimes it just put them to sleep permanently. Pharmacologists kept synthesizing new variants, trying to create faster-acting versions or longer-lasting ones, fine-tuning the molecular structure like mechanics adjusting an engine. Phenobarbital arrived in 1912, marketed as luminol by the German company Bayer. This version had a longer duration, making it ideal for controlling epilepsy. Patients who had suffered daily seizures found themselves suddenly able to live normal lives, which seemed like a miracle until they discovered that stopping the medication caused seizures worse than the ones they'd originally experienced. The drug had quietly made itself necessary, rewriting brain chemistry until natural function became impossible without chemical assistance. Dependency wasn't considered addiction, though, because addiction was something that happened with street drugs, not medicine prescribed by respected physicians in clean offices. World War I interrupted the pharmaceutical expansion, but didn't stop it. Soldiers on both sides used barbiturates to cope with the psychological aftermath of trench warfare, though doctors called it shell shock rather than trauma, because admitting war could break men's minds was considered bad for morale. The pills let them sleep despite the memories, shutting down consciousness before nightmares could start. Military physicians distributed barbiturates like rations, considering them essential to maintaining fighting capacity. Thousands of soldiers returned home with prescriptions and dependencies they'd never asked for, though the full implications wouldn't become clear for another decade. By 1920, barbiturates had become standard medical practice. They were prescribed for insomnia, anxiety, epilepsy, high blood pressure, and the general condition of being a woman who expressed any emotion stronger than mild contentment. Female patients received prescriptions at 3 times the rate of men, doctors having decided that women's nervous systems were inherently more fragile and required chemical stabilization. The pills promised control over the uncontrollable aspects of human existence: the racing thoughts at 3 in the morning, the inexplicable panic attacks, the sense that life was moving too fast and consciousness needed to slow down or stop entirely. Barbiturates delivered on that promise every time, which made them irresistible to a society that increasingly believed chemistry could solve problems that previous generations had simply endured. The pharmaceutical industry expanded production to meet skyrocketing demand. Companies like Eli Lilly and Abbott Laboratories in America began developing their own barbiturate formulations, competing to create versions that acted faster, or lasted longer, or caused fewer side effects the next morning. Each new variant received enthusiastic medical reception and immediate commercial success. The drugs were cheap to manufacture, requiring only basic laboratory equipment and chemical precursors that were readily available. Profit margins were extraordinary. Nobody in the industry had any incentive to investigate potential long-term consequences when short-term results looked so impressive and quarterly earnings kept climbing. Chemists synthesized more than 50 different barbiturate variants between 1903 and 1930. Each one was essentially the same drug with minor molecular modifications, like changing a car's paint color and calling it a new model. The pharmaceutical companies marketed these variations as innovations, giving them distinct brand names that disguised their fundamental similarity. Doctors prescribed them interchangeably, rarely understanding that they were all variations on the same neurological dimmer switch. Patients accumulated prescriptions from multiple physicians, building collections of pills that differed in name but not in their essential function, shutting down consciousness through chemical force. The medical literature from this era reads like advertising copy. Journal articles praised barbiturates' reliability, their consistent effects, their apparent safety compared to older sedatives. Addiction was rarely mentioned except as something that happened to people with moral failings, rather than as an inevitable consequence of regular use. The concept of physical dependence was poorly understood, and the idea that a medication could chemically alter brain function until stopping became medically dangerous hadn't fully penetrated medical consciousness. Doctors operated under the comfortable assumption that if they prescribed it, it must be safe. By 1930, America was consuming barbiturates at a rate that would have shocked the chemists who first synthesized them. Millions of prescriptions were written annually. The pills had become normalized, integrated into daily life as thoroughly as coffee or aspirin. Taking a sleeping pill was considered no more remarkable than taking vitamins, just another aspect of modern self-care. The cultural acceptance was total and unquestioned, which made it the perfect foundation for disaster. Everyone was swallowing sedation and calling it medicine, building dependencies they didn't recognize while physicians wrote prescriptions with the confidence of people who genuinely believed they were helping. The stage was set. The pills were distributed. The deaths were coming, though nobody knew it yet except the actuaries at life insurance companies, who were starting to notice patterns in their mortality statistics that didn't make immediate sense. The 1930s turned barbiturates from medical innovation into American obsession. Pharmaceutical companies synthesized new variants at a pace that suggested competition rather than healthcare, each claiming their version worked faster or smoother, or with fewer morning-after effects that made patients feel like they'd been hit by trucks. Pentobarbital arrived in 1930 under the brand name Nembutal, marketed as the gold standard for insomnia because it worked within 15 minutes and lasted through the night. Abbott Laboratories sold it in distinctive yellow capsules that would eventually become so famous they'd earn the street name Yellow Jackets. Sedative followed in 1934, branded as Seconal and packaged in red capsules that users would later call Reds or Red Devils, with the kind of affectionate nickname people give to things that are slowly destroying them. Doctors prescribed these new variants with increasing creativity. Barbiturates became the answer to every medical question that didn't have a better solution. can't sleep, barbiturates, anxious, barbiturates, high blood pressure, barbiturates to calm the nervous system, migraine headaches, barbiturates to dull the pain, difficult childbirth, barbiturates to sedate the mother into what physicians called twilight sleep, though chemically induced unconsciousness would have been more accurate. The drugs moved from psychiatric specialty to general practice, from hospital settings to family medicine, until every physician in America had a prescription pad full of chemical sedation waiting to be distributed. The surgical applications revolutionized anesthesiology almost overnight. Thiopental, introduced in 1936 and sold as sodium pentothal, worked so rapidly that patients lost consciousness within seconds of injection. Surgeons could operate on patients who were deeply unconscious, but still breathing on their own, a massive improvement over ether and chloroform that required constant monitoring to prevent accidental death. Thiopental became the standard induction agent for surgery, used in every major hospital across America and Europe. The military adopted it immediately, seeing its potential for battlefield medicine where speed mattered more than pharmaceutical elegance. Combat surgeons could put wounded soldiers under in seconds, operate, and move to the next casualty without the complications of older anesthetics. America's barbiturate consumption exploded beyond anything pharmaceutical companies had projected. By 1940, doctors were writing over 1 billion doses annually, a number so staggering it suggests every American was taking sedatives regularly. The actual distribution was less democratic. Some people were taking handfuls daily while others never touched them. But the aggregate consumption revealed a nation attempting to chemically manage its collective anxiety. The Depression had given everyone something to be nervous about, and barbiturates offered temporary relief that was legal, socially acceptable, and covered by the emerging health insurance industry. Eli Lilly pushed Amital, their barbiturate brand, with advertising campaigns that targeted physicians rather than patients. Medical journals filled with full-page advertisements showing peaceful sleeping faces and charts demonstrating superior pharmacokinetics compared to competitor products. The marketing never mentioned addiction, dependency, or overdose risk. Those words didn't appear in pharmaceutical advertising because acknowledging them would have destroyed the carefully constructed image of barbiturates as safe modern medicine. The companies spent millions on promotional materials, free samples for doctors, sponsored medical conferences where researchers presented favourable studies funded by the same corporations selling the drugs being studied. Phenobarbital became the go-to medication for epilepsy, and the results seemed miraculous to patients who'd spent their lives trapped by unpredictable seizures. People who couldn't hold jobs or live independently suddenly found themselves capable of normal existence. The drug suppressed seizure activity so effectively that neurologists considered it a breakthrough comparable to insulin for diabetes. Patients took it daily, often for years, building dependencies that went unrecognized because the medication was preventing a legitimate medical condition. The distinction between therapeutic use and addiction blurred into meaninglessness when stopping the drug caused seizures worse than the original condition. The military's relationship with barbiturates deepened as World War II approached. Soldiers received them for combat stress, shell shock, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then considered weakness or cowardice. Army physicians distributed pills to keep soldiers functional, using sedatives to dampen psychological responses that interfered with military effectiveness. The approach worked in the short term. Men who couldn't sleep after watching their friends die could take a pill and get 6 hours of unconsciousness, but created thousands of dependent veterans who returned home with habits that civilian doctors would continue enabling. Combat medics carried barbiturates alongside morphine, using them for wounded soldiers who needed sedation during transport or before surgery. The drugs proved invaluable in field hospitals, where screaming patients interfered with medical operations and psychological trauma was considered less urgent than physical injuries. Military medicine ran on barbiturates and morphine, chemical solutions to problems that would have required psychological intervention if anyone had believed mental wounds were real injuries. The VA hospital system would spend the next 3 decades dealing with veterans who'd been introduced to barbiturates in military service and couldn't stop using them in civilian life. Pharmaceutical production ramped up to industrial scale during the war. Abbott, Lilly, and other companies manufactured barbiturates by the ton, shipping them to military installations worldwide. The profit margins were spectacular even at government contract prices. Corporate executives justified the expansion as patriotic duty, supporting American soldiers while simultaneously building market share that would serve them well when peace returned. The war normalized barbiturate use among an entire generation of young men who had become the middle-aged consumers of the 1950s, creating a customer base that already knew the drugs and trusted them. Pentobarbital found use in veterinary medicine, putting animals to sleep before surgery or euthanasia. The same drug that gave humans a night's rest could kill a dog humanely within minutes at higher doses, which should have been a warning sign but instead was treated as proof of versatility. Veterinarians kept bottles of concentrated pentobarbital that could end consciousness permanently with a single injection, and the pharmaceutical companies sold these preparations alongside the human medications without apparent irony. The line between sedation and death was just a matter of dosage, a fact that wouldn't fully register in medical consciousness until celebrities started dying. Cultural acceptance reached levels that seem insane in retrospect. Magazine advertisements showed elegant women taking their evening pills with the same casualness as removing makeup. Pharmaceutical companies sponsored radio programs and, later, television shows that featured doctors praising modern medicine's ability to ensure restful sleep. The pills appeared in movies as props indicating sophisticated modernity, glamorous actresses keeping pill bottles on their nightstands like cosmetics. Nobody questioned this because everyone was doing it, and mass participation creates its own legitimacy regardless of actual safety. The medical profession's faith in barbiturates remained unshaken despite accumulating evidence of problems. Doctors saw patients who couldn't sleep without pills, but attributed this to the underlying insomnia rather than drug dependency. They saw accidental overdoses, but blamed patient carelessness rather than the narrow margin between therapeutic and lethal doses. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position was enormous, yet physicians managed it with ease because admitting the drugs were dangerous would have meant admitting they'd been harming patients for decades. Professional pride prevented honest evaluation. Hospitals used barbiturates for everything from pre-surgical sedation to managing agitated psychiatric patients. Mental institutions fed them to schizophrenic patients by the handful, using chemical sedation instead of the psychotherapy that was expensive and time-consuming. Barbiturates became chemical straitjackets, tools for managing rather than treating mental illness. Patients shuffled through institutional hallways in drug-induced stupors, too sedated to be disruptive, but also too sedated to participate in any meaningful recovery. The drugs maintained order while destroying any possibility of actual healing. Research into barbiturate addiction was sparse and deliberately constrained by pharmaceutical funding. The few scientists who investigated dependency found that tolerance developed rapidly. Patients needed increasing doses to achieve the same effects, and that withdrawal could be medically dangerous, causing seizures, hallucinations, and death. These findings were published in obscure medical journals where they could be safely ignored by practicing physicians who didn't have time to read research contradicting their prescribing habits. The knowledge existed but didn't spread because too many people had financial or professional interests in maintaining ignorance. Street markets for barbiturates began emerging in the 1940s, though they weren't called street markets because the drugs were obtained through prescription fraud rather than illegal manufacturing. People visited multiple doctors, collecting prescriptions they'd fill at different pharmacies to avoid suspicion. Pharmacists noticed patients getting refills too frequently, but rarely refused to fill prescriptions written by licensed physicians. The legal framework around controlled substances barely existed, and barbiturates weren't considered particularly dangerous by law enforcement. They were medicine, not drugs, and the distinction seemed important even though the effects were identical. Teenagers discovered barbiturates by raiding their parents' medicine cabinets, finding pills that were more reliable than alcohol and didn't leave obvious signs of intoxication. High school students in the late 1940s passed around Nembutal and Seconal at parties, washing them down with Coca-Cola and calling it a good time. The recreational use was sporadic at first, limited to kids with access to their parents' prescriptions, but it established patterns that would explode in the following decades. Adults assumed their children were safe because the pills came from doctors rather than street dealers, demonstrating once again that legitimacy matters more than actual danger in determining social acceptance. By 1950, America was consuming more barbiturates per capita than any nation in history. The drugs had become infrastructure, as fundamental to daily life as electricity or automobiles. Millions of people couldn't sleep without them. Hundreds of thousands were physically dependent. Emergency rooms saw regular overdoses, though exact statistics were rarely compiled because barbiturate deaths were classified as accidents or suicides rather than drug-related fatalities. The scale of the problem remained hidden because it was everywhere, like trying to see fog when you're standing in it. Everyone knew someone who took sleeping pills. That made it normal rather than alarming, which was exactly the environment needed for a slow-motion public health catastrophe. Hollywood discovered barbiturates the way it discovered everything else, through exploitation disguised as necessity. The studio system of the 1940s operated on schedules that treated human beings like machinery that could run indefinitely if properly maintained with the right chemical lubricants. Actors worked 18-hour days, 6 days a week, filming multiple movies simultaneously while maintaining publicity appearances and radio commitments that kept them in the public eye. Sleep became a luxury the studios couldn't afford to grant, so they eliminated the need for it through pharmaceutical intervention. Studio doctors weren't there to protect actors' health, but to keep them functional regardless of what that required. MGM pioneered the system of uppers and downers that would become standard practice across Hollywood. Amphetamines got actors awake and energetic for early morning shoots. Barbiturates knocked them unconscious at night so they could get a few hours of chemically induced rest before the amphetamine started again. The cycle was vicious and self-perpetuating. The uppers made natural sleep impossible, necessitating the downers, which left actors groggy in the morning, necessitating more uppers. Studio physicians managed this pharmaceutical balancing act with the casual confidence of people who'd never personally experienced addiction and didn't consider it relevant to their professional duties. Judy Garland was 15 years old when MGM put her on the pill regimen that would eventually kill her. Studio executives looked at the girl who'd just played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz and saw a profitable asset that needed optimization. She was pudgy by Hollywood standards, prone to adolescent energy crashes, and unable to maintain the grueling schedule MGM demanded. The solution was chemical: Benzodrine tablets to suppress appetite and provide energy during 16-hour shooting days, Seconal capsules to force sleep when her amphetamine-wired nervous system refused to shut down naturally. Her mother signed off on this arrangement because studio doctors assured her the medications were safe and necessary, Though what choice did she really have when refusing meant terminating her daughter's contract and returning to poverty? The transformation was rapid and profitable. Garland lost weight, maintained energy through impossible schedules, and completed films at a pace that delighted MGM executives who saw only the output without considering the cost. She was taking pills before she understood what they were, building dependencies before her brain had finished developing. Studio doctors adjusted her doses casually, increasing barbiturates when she complained about insomnia, adding more amphetamines when her energy flagged. The pharmaceutical management became more important than the actual performances, as if the films were just convenient vehicles for testing human tolerance to chemical manipulation. Other teenage performers received identical treatment, though Garland's case was the most extreme and would become the most famous. Mickey Rooney was on the same regimen while filming the Andy Hardy series. Countless other child actors whose names are now forgotten were given pills by studio doctors who considered it routine medical care rather than systematic abuse. The practice was so normalized that actors' contracts sometimes explicitly stated the studio had authority over their medical treatment, giving legal cover to what was essentially forced drugging. Parents who objected found their children's contracts terminated, replaced by more compliant families desperate for Hollywood money. Adult actors fared no better despite having the theoretical right to refuse medication. Veronica Lake maintained her glamorous image through barbiturates that smoothed her anxiety and alcohol that she used to enhance their effects, a combination that was both popular and deadly. Her career imploded by the late 1940s as the pills stopped working and the doses increased beyond functionality. She went from leading lady to forgotten alcoholic in less than 5 years, though the barbiturates rarely got mentioned in articles about her decline because prescription drug addiction wasn't considered real addiction when it came from doctors rather than street dealers. Lana Turner kept bottles of Nembutal and Seconal in her dressing room, taking them between scenes to manage the anxiety that came from being treated like beautiful property rather than a human being. Studio photographers captured her at premieres and parties looking radiant and composed, never showing the pill bottles that made that composure possible. Her 7 marriages and multiple suicide attempts would later be attributed to bad choices in men rather than to the chemical dependency that made stable relationships impossible. The narrative required that female stars be troubled rather than addicted, emotional rather than chemically dependent, because acknowledging pharmaceutical addiction would have implicated the studio system that created it. The glamorization was deliberate and remarkably effective. Fan magazines ran articles about stars' beauty routines that casually mentioned sleeping pills as if they were face cream. Photographs showed actresses' nightstands adorned with elegant pill bottles alongside perfume and jewelry, making barbiturates seem like luxury items rather than addictive sedatives. Movies featured characters taking pills in scenes meant to convey sophistication. The modern woman managing her life through modern chemistry. The cultural message was clear. Successful people used pharmaceuticals to optimize their performance, and refusing to do so meant accepting mediocrity. The wealthy embraced barbiturates as status symbols, prescription bottles becoming accessories that demonstrated access to quality medical care. Upper-class women collected physicians who'd write prescriptions for Seconal or Nembutal without asking uncomfortable questions about usage patterns or dependency. Having a personal doctor who understood that you needed pharmaceutical assistance to cope with the stress of being rich was a mark of sophistication, like having a personal trainer or interior decorator. The pills themselves became designer drugs before that term existed, with patients expressing preferences for specific brands based on the color of the capsules or the smoothness of the effects. Physicians who catered to Hollywood developed reputations as people who understood that creative personalities required special pharmaceutical management. These doctors wrote prescriptions that would have shocked their colleagues in normal medical practice, but they justified it as necessary accommodation for the unique pressures of entertainment industry success. They charged enormous fees for this understanding, building practices that were more about enabling addiction than treating illness. Some became celebrities themselves, invited to parties and premieres, their medical licenses providing legitimacy to what was essentially high-end drug dealing. The mother's little helper phenomenon emerged before the Rolling Stones wrote the song that would name it. Middle-class housewives saw articles about sophisticated Hollywood women using sleeping pills and wanted the same chemical assistance with their own lives. Family doctors obliged, writing prescriptions for barbiturates to manage the stress of suburban motherhood, the anxiety of keeping perfect homes, the exhaustion of raising children without the household help their own mothers had employed. The pills promised to make them better wives and mothers by making them too sedated to feel the frustration of their circumscribed lives. Pharmaceutical companies recognized the marketing opportunity and targeted women specifically. Medical journals carried advertisements showing housewives overwhelmed by domestic duties, with barbiturates presented as the solution to female emotional instability. The ads never used the word addiction, but instead promoted management of women's supposedly fragile nervous systems. Doctors absorbed these messages and prescribed accordingly, writing millions of barbiturate prescriptions for women whose primary symptom was being conscious of their limited options. The pills worked exactly as intended, dampening awareness and replacing dissatisfaction with chemical indifference. Department stores began stocking decorative pill boxes as accessories for fashionable women. Jewelry designers created gold and silver containers meant to hold a day's supply of pills, turning medication into fashion statement. The pill box became standard equipment in women's purses alongside lipstick and compact mirrors, another tool for maintaining the appearance of effortless perfection. Nobody asked what it meant that women needed drugs to function in their daily lives, or if the requirement for chemical assistance indicated problems with the lives themselves rather than with the women living them. The party scene in Hollywood and New York developed its own barbiturate culture, separate from the studio system's forced medication. Jazz musicians used them to come down from cocaine and amphetamines, creating the speedball effect that would become standard in entertainment industry drug use. Socialites took them recreationally at parties, mixing barbiturates with alcohol to achieve intense intoxication that was technically legal, because both substances came from legitimate sources. The combinations were far more dangerous than either drug alone, but users didn't know or care because the effects were exactly what they wanted: obliteration of consciousness without the social stigma of illegal drug use. Barbiturates became conversation pieces at upscale gatherings, with guests comparing which varieties they preferred and which doctors wrote the best prescriptions. The discussions had the character of wine connoisseurs debating vintages, turning dangerous sedatives into sophisticated consumables. This social acceptance among the wealthy and famous filtered down to everyone who aspired to their lifestyle, which in 1940s and 1950s America was essentially everybody. Taking sleeping pills stopped being medical treatment and became aspirational behavior, something that separated modern successful people from those still struggling with outdated concepts like natural sleep. The studios weaponized this glamorization, using it to deflect criticism when actors' pill dependencies became too obvious to ignore. They could point to the broader cultural acceptance and claim they were simply providing access to medications that were standard among successful people everywhere. The circular logic was perfect. Barbiturates were safe because everyone used them, and everyone used them because they were safe. Any evidence to the contrary was dismissed as isolated incidents rather than patterns indicating systematic problems. Teen magazines began running advice columns that assumed readers' mothers took pills and treated this as normal. articles about managing homework stress or dealing with social anxiety casually mentioned that many successful women used pharmaceutical assistance, planting the idea that chemical solutions to emotional problems were both acceptable and necessary for ambitious girls. The next generation was being groomed for barbiturate dependency before they were old enough to get their own prescriptions, though they'd have no trouble accessing their mother's medicine cabinets when the time came. By 1955, Hollywood had fully integrated barbiturates into its operational structure. Every major studio had doctors on staff who existed primarily to write prescriptions for uppers and downers. Every contract player had access to these medications as a standard employment benefit, like health insurance or commissary privileges. The system was so entrenched that questioning it marked someone as naive or difficult, qualities that ended careers faster than any scandal. Everyone from studio executives to makeup artists knew actors were being systematically addicted to maintain production schedules, and everyone accepted it as the price of making movies in a system built on human exploitation. The pills just made the exploitation more efficient. The first celebrity barbiturate death that made national headlines was comedian Bobby Driscoll's in 1968, but the pattern started decades earlier with people whose names weren't famous enough to register as warnings. A Broadway actress in 1947 took her usual dose of Seconal after a performance, forgot she'd taken it in her drugged confusion, took another dose, then another, and never woke up. The autopsy showed lethal levels of secobarbital in her system, but the death certificate listed accidental overdose, as if accidents were natural causes rather than predictable consequences of distributing dangerous drugs without adequate warnings. Her death warranted 2 paragraphs in Variety and was forgotten within a week. The medical community finally began acknowledging what coroners had been seeing for years. Barbiturate addiction was real, severe, and potentially more dangerous than heroin. Dr. Harris Isbell at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, conducted studies in the early 1950s that demonstrated barbiturate withdrawal could kill patients who'd been taking therapeutic doses prescribed by legitimate physicians. The findings were published in respected journals, where they could be safely ignored by doctors who'd spent decades prescribing these medications and weren't interested in admitting they'd been creating addicts. Isbell's research showed that physical dependence developed within weeks of regular use, that tolerance increased rapidly, requiring ever higher doses, and that attempting to stop cold turkey after extended use caused seizures, hallucinations, and death rates that exceeded heroin withdrawal by significant margins. Heroin users could quit and suffer terribly, but usually survive. Barbiturate users who tried the same approach died in hospital beds while experiencing seizures their brains couldn't survive. The irony was brutal. The legal, doctor-prescribed medication was deadlier to quit than the illegal street drug that sent people to prison. Yet pharmaceutical companies continued marketing barbiturates as safe, while law enforcement focused on heroin, creating a public policy that criminalized the less dangerous substance, while doctors freely distributed the more lethal one. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position was staggering, but humans excel at ignoring contradictions when acknowledging them requires uncomfortable changes to established systems. The therapeutic window, the gap between an effective dose and a lethal one, was terrifyingly narrow for barbiturates. A person might take 3 pills nightly for months without problems, then take 5 pills one night because they'd built tolerance and needed more to achieve sleep and simply not wake up. The difference between sedation and death was often just 2 capsules, a margin of error that wouldn't be acceptable for any medication introduced today, but was considered normal for barbiturates because they'd been used for so long that familiarity created false confidence. Doctors prescribed them in bottles of 30 or 60 pills, giving suicidal patients the means to kill themselves while treating their depression with the same drugs that made suicide convenient. Automatism became the medical term for a phenomenon that was killing people regularly. Users would take their prescribed dose, fall into a confused semi-consciousness where they forgot they'd taken anything, reach for the bottle again, and continue this cycle until they'd consumed lethal amounts without any intent to die. The drugs destroyed the very cognitive function needed to use them safely, creating a perfect trap. Investigators examining these deaths would find bottles of barbiturates on nightstands next to bodies showing no signs of suicide intent. No notes, no preparations, just people who'd gone to bed and accidentally killed themselves with their doctor-prescribed sleep medication. The death certificate said accidental overdose, but should have said predictable pharmaceutical failure. Emergency rooms began seeing barbiturate overdoses weekly by the mid-1950s, then daily, then multiple times per shift. Patients arrived unconscious with breathing so depressed they were turning blue, requiring immediate intervention to prevent death. The treatment was primitive: pump the stomach, provide oxygen, wait, and hope the liver metabolized the drug before it stopped the heart. Many didn't survive despite aggressive medical care, dying in emergency rooms while doctors watched helplessly. Those who survived often had no memory of taking excessive doses, describing their usual bedtime routine and expressing genuine shock at being told they'd nearly died. The drugs had robbed them of the ability to remember endangering themselves. Teenagers started showing up in emergency rooms with barbiturate overdoses that weren't suicide attempts, but recreational misadventures. High school students who'd raided their parents' medicine cabinets treated the pills like alcohol, taking them at parties without understanding that the dose-response curve was exponential rather than linear. 2 pills might produce mild sedation, 4 pills might cause intense intoxication, and 6 pills might cause coma and death. The progression wasn't predictable because individual tolerance varied wildly, making recreational use essentially Russian roulette with pharmaceuticals. Parents whose children died this way had to confront the fact that the murder weapon came from their own medicine cabinets, prescribed by trusted family doctors who'd assured them the medications were safe. The street market for barbiturates exploded in the mid-1950s, despite them being prescription-only medications. Illegal manufacturers discovered that barbiturates were relatively simple to synthesize, requiring only basic chemistry knowledge and equipment that could be purchased legally. They produced pills that were indistinguishable from pharmaceutical products, selling them through the same networks that distributed heroin and cocaine. Users couldn't tell the difference between legitimate prescriptions and street versions, which meant quality control was non-existent and dosing was guesswork. People died from pills that were twice as strong as expected, or mixed with contaminants that wouldn't kill by themselves, but became lethal in combination. Prescription fraud became an industry unto itself. People forged prescriptions, stole prescription pads from doctors' offices, or simply visited multiple physicians and lied about their symptoms to collect pills they'd either use themselves or resell. Pharmacists were supposed to track this activity but rarely did, either because they were overwhelmed with legitimate business, or because they didn't particularly care whether customers were accumulating excessive supplies. The regulatory framework was designed for a different era, when patients respected medical authority and doctors monitored their prescriptions carefully. Neither assumption held true anymore, but the system hadn't adapted because bureaucracies changed slowly, and pharmaceutical profits ensured that nobody with power wanted aggressive enforcement. Jazz musicians developed particularly sophisticated barbiturate habits, using them to balance the effects of cocaine and heroin in combinations that seemed to defy pharmacology's rules about lethal drug interactions. Billie Holiday was taking Seconal regularly by the early 1950s, mixing it with heroin and alcohol in quantities that should have killed her years before she actually died in 1959. Chet Baker survived multiple overdoses that combined barbiturates with everything else available, his body developing tolerance that was medically inexplicable. These weren't cautious users measuring doses carefully. They were people throwing pills and powder into their systems and hoping the combinations wouldn't stop their hearts. Mostly they were right, but the ones who were wrong ended up dead in hotel rooms with pill bottles scattered on the floor. The military's chickens came home to roost as Korean War veterans returned with barbiturate habits, acquired in military hospitals, where doctors used them to manage combat stress and physical injuries. The VA continued prescribing them because stopping would have meant acknowledging that military medicine had created dependencies, and institutional responsibility was something the government avoided when possible. Veterans collected monthly prescriptions that far exceeded any therapeutic need. Building stockpiles, they'd either use themselves or sell to supplement disability payments that weren't sufficient for rent and food. The VA essentially became a government-funded drug distribution system, though nobody used those words because they were politically untenable. Women's magazines began publishing articles about sleeping pill addiction in the late 1950s, though they framed it as individual moral failure rather than systematic pharmaceutical negligence. The stories featured women who'd become dependent on barbiturates, describing their struggles to quit while carefully avoiding any suggestion that doctors who'd prescribed these medications bore responsibility. The articles served as warnings but also as advertisements, detailing the effects and availability of various barbiturates in ways that informed potential users where to get them and what to expect. The public health message was accidentally creating a how-to guide for aspiring pill users. Suicide by barbiturate became so common, it was almost banal. People who decided to end their lives had ready access to the means in their own medicine cabinets, requiring no special preparation or access to exotic methods. The pills were marketed as providing peaceful sleep, and suicide by barbiturate was essentially that: falling asleep and never waking up, dying from respiratory depression that shut down breathing while consciousness was already gone. It was considered a clean method, preferable to violent alternatives, which made barbiturates the choice for people who wanted to die without mess or drama. The ease of this method undoubtedly increased the suicide rate among people who might have reconsidered if killing themselves required more difficult preparations. Coroners started tracking barbiturate deaths separately from other drug fatalities because the numbers were climbing so rapidly they distorted overall statistics. A major city might see 50 barbiturate deaths annually in 1950, 100 in 1955, 200 by 1960. The curve was exponential, suggesting that each death somehow enabled more deaths by normalizing the danger and demonstrating the method. Families who'd lost someone to barbiturate overdose often still had bottles of the drugs in their medicine cabinets because their own prescriptions continued, creating multi-generational dependencies where grandparents, parents and teenagers were all taking the same dangerous medications prescribed by doctors who either didn't know or didn't care about the accumulated family risk. The medical establishment maintained its collective denial with impressive determination. Professional journals published articles about barbiturate addiction, but never suggested that doctors should stop prescribing them, instead recommending better patient education and monitoring, as if the problem was patient misuse rather than fundamental pharmaceutical danger. Pharmaceutical companies funded continuing education courses for physicians that emphasized the benefits of barbiturates, while minimizing risks in ways that were technically accurate but practically deceptive. The entire system was designed to keep pills flowing because too many people were making too much money to allow concerns about patient safety to interfere with profitable prescribing patterns. Insurance companies noticed the death toll first because they tracked mortality statistics that included cause of death. Life insurance actuaries saw the patterns clearly. barbiturate-related deaths were climbing steadily across all demographics, with particularly sharp increases among middle-aged women and veterans. Some companies began excluding coverage for deaths involving barbiturates, or adding premium surcharges for applicants who admitted to using sleeping pills regularly. These business decisions, based on pure financial calculation, provided more honest assessment of barbiturate danger than any medical journal, though nobody paid attention because insurance adjustments don't make headlines the way dramatic deaths do. By 1960, America was experiencing a full-scale barbiturate epidemic that nobody wanted to call an epidemic because doing so would require admitting that doctors and pharmaceutical companies had created it. The deaths were classified as individual tragedies rather than systematic failure, accidents rather than predictable outcomes, personal weakness rather than pharmaceutical negligence. The language used to describe barbiturate deaths carefully avoided suggesting that the drugs themselves or the system that distributed them bore any responsibility. Every death was somehow the user's fault, taking too many pills, mixing them with alcohol, failing to follow instructions that were inadequate even when followed perfectly. The victim blaming was comprehensive and effective, protecting the institutions and industries that had created the problem while ensuring the pattern would continue until something forced acknowledgement that couldn't be deflected or ignored. Judy Garland's suicide attempt started in 1947 when she was 25 years old and had been taking barbiturates for a decade. She slashed her wrists in a bathroom at MGM after a confrontation with studio executives about her unreliability, though the unreliability was caused by the drugs they'd been feeding her since she was 15. The studio covered it up, released a statement about exhaustion, and increased her barbiturate prescriptions to manage the anxiety that was making her suicidal. The logic was circular and deadly. The pills caused the problems they were prescribed to treat, creating a pharmaceutical trap that tightened with every dose. She attempted suicide again in 1950, this time with an overdose of Seconal that nearly succeeded before someone found her unconscious and called an ambulance. The hospital pumped her stomach and sent her home with a psychiatrist's prescription for more barbiturates, because nobody could imagine treating mental illness without chemical sedation. Her career disintegrated through the 1950s as the pills stopped working and started destroying everything they touched. She was fired from MGM in 1950 after becoming so unreliable that even a studio that had created her dependency couldn't continue employing her. Concert tours became disasters where she'd appear hours late, too drugged to perform coherently, or not appear at all because she'd taken too many pills and couldn't be awakened. Audiences who'd loved her, as Dorothy watched her stumble through performances in states that ranged from mildly sedated to barely conscious. The reviews were brutal, but critics blamed personal instability rather than pharmaceutical addiction, because acknowledging the drugs would have meant implicating an entire industry's prescribing practices. Her tolerance had escalated to doses that would kill normal users, taking 20 or 30 Seconal capsules daily, plus whatever amphetamines she needed to counteract the sedation when she had to function. Her body had adapted to poison levels of barbiturates, developing metabolic processes that cleared the drugs faster than should have been physiologically possible. This adaptation was both remarkable and tragic. It kept her alive while ensuring she'd need increasingly massive doses to achieve any effect, eventually reaching a point where the amount required to feel normal would accidentally become the amount that stopped her breathing. She was a walking demonstration of tolerance's cruel progression, alive only because her liver had become extraordinarily efficient at processing the chemicals that were destroying her. Alan Ladd died on January 29, 1964, found in his Palm Springs home with lethal levels of alcohol and sedatives in his system. The official ruling was accidental overdose, though people who knew him suspected suicide that would never be confirmed. He'd been taking barbiturates for years to manage anxiety and insomnia that came from being a sensitive man working in an industry that rewarded emotional emptiness. His career had peaked in the 1940s and was declining through the 1950s as he aged out of leading roles and developed a drinking problem that mixed catastrophically with his prescription medications. Friends said he'd been depressed about his fading career, but the depression was inseparable from the chemical dependency that had been prescribed as treatment for earlier, milder anxiety that might have resolved naturally if given time instead of pills. The autopsy revealed a man whose body was saturated with chemicals, barbiturates, alcohol, and residual amphetamines, creating a toxic cocktail that his 49-year-old liver couldn't process fast enough to prevent death. He'd been mixing these substances for so long that determining whether the final dose was suicidal intent or habitual carelessness became impossible. The distinction mattered legally but not medically. Dead is dead regardless of intent, and the chemicals that killed him came from prescriptions written by physicians who'd never adequately warned him that mixing them with alcohol was potentially lethal. His death made headlines for a week before being replaced by newer tragedies in a culture that processed celebrity deaths quickly and moved on without examining the systems that produced them. Dorothy Kilgallen died on November 8, 1965, sitting up in bed with a book in her lap and enough barbiturates and alcohol in her system to stop her heart. She was a journalist who'd covered organised crime, the JFK assassination, and had interviewed Jack Ruby, leading to conspiracy theories that she'd been murdered for knowing too much. The more mundane explanation was that she'd been taking Seconal and drinking heavily for years, and one night the combination finally killed her. The conspiracy theories were more interesting than acknowledging that another woman had died from medications prescribed to manage the stress of being successful in a world that punished successful women by making them chemically dependent. Her death certificate listed circumstances undetermined, which was medical bureaucracy's way of admitting they couldn't tell whether she'd meant to die or had simply miscalculated her usual dose after drinking. The police found multiple prescription bottles in her home, evidence that she'd been doctor shopping to maintain supplies that no single physician would have prescribed. She'd been open about taking sleeping pills, discussing them in her newspaper column as casually as recommending restaurants, contributing to the cultural normalization that made barbiturate addiction seem like sophisticated lifestyle choice rather than medical emergency. Her death at 52 should have prompted examination of prescribing practices, but instead generated speculation about mafia hits and government conspiracies that were more exciting than pharmaceutical negligence. Inga Stevens died on April 30th, 1970 from acute barbiturate intoxication at age 35. She'd been taking pills for depression and insomnia, prescribed by doctors who apparently never considered that the medications might be worsening the conditions they were supposed to treat. Her death was ruled suicide, though friends insisted she'd show no signs of wanting to die, suggesting automatism or accidental overdose that resulted from the cognitive impairment barbiturates caused. The ambiguity was typical. Most barbiturate deaths existed in a grey zone between accident and suicide because the drugs destroyed the judgment needed to use them safely, while providing the means to end life either intentionally or carelessly. She'd been a successful television actress on The Farmer's Daughter, performing weekly while managing a barbiturate dependency that was invisible to audiences who saw only the polished final product. The pills helped her function through anxiety and depression that came from childhood trauma, failed relationships, and the psychological pressure of maintaining a television career. Hollywood's response to her death was memorial services and fond remembrances that carefully avoided mentioning she'd died from drugs prescribed to help her cope with working in Hollywood. The circular logic was perfect. The industry created the stress, prescribed the pills to manage the stress, then mourned the deaths the pills caused without acknowledging its role in the cycle. The pattern was becoming undeniable even to people determined to ignore it. Successful performers were dying from prescription medications in their 30s, 40s, and 50s at rates that suggested systematic rather than individual problems. The deaths shared common elements: multiple prescriptions from multiple doctors, combinations of barbiturates with alcohol or other drugs, official rulings of accident or suicide that avoided examining why so many talented people were dying the same way. Entertainment industry executives knew these patterns intimately because they'd created and maintained them, but acknowledging this would have required admitting that Hollywood's business model depended on chemically manipulating performers until they became dependent. Judy Garland's final years were a cascade of cancelled performances, emergency hospitalizations, and suicide attempts that became regular enough to stop making headlines. She attempted suicide in Hong Kong in 1964 by slashing her throat, was hospitalized in London in 1967 for barbiturate overdose, and lived in constant financial crisis because she couldn't maintain consistent work while taking doses that kept her oscillating between unconscious and manic. She married 5 times, each relationship collapsing under the weight of her addiction and the personality changes the drugs caused. The woman who'd been America's sweetheart at 16 was a pharmaceutical wreck at 45, kept alive by metabolic adaptations that were medically fascinating and personally devastating. Her tolerance had reached levels that seemed impossible, taking 60-secondal capsules daily just to feel normal, requiring amounts that would kill a dozen people to achieve sedation. Doctors who examined her were astonished she was alive, her liver processing barbiturates at rates that suggested physiological adaptation that should have been impossible. This extraordinary tolerance meant she could never quit safely, because the withdrawal would kill her faster than the drugs, trapping her in a dependency that was literally inescapable. She was a prisoner of her own metabolism, adapted to poison, until poison became necessary for survival. The medical community that created these situations maintained careful distance from the consequences. Doctors who'd written the prescriptions rarely attended the funerals, and when they did, they offered condolences without accepting responsibility. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the drugs released statements expressing sadness while defending their products as safe when used as directed, ignoring that the directions were inadequate and the safety margins were non-existent. The entire system operated on collective denial, with everyone involved acknowledging individual tragedies while refusing to see the pattern that connected them. Barbiturate deaths among non-celebrities were far more common, but received no media attention beyond brief obituaries that listed heart failure or accidental overdose without elaboration. For every famous person who died, hundreds of housewives, veterans, and regular people taking prescribed medications ended up in morgues with the same toxicology reports. The celebrity deaths at least generated temporary awareness, though that awareness rarely translated into changed behaviour because the famous deaths were treated as exceptional circumstances rather than representative examples of widespread pharmaceutical disaster. The entertainment industry's response to mounting casualties was neither reform nor reconsideration, but rather improved public relations management. Studios developed protocols for handling talent deaths that emphasized the deceased's struggles with personal demons, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that industry practices contributed to those demons. Press releases were carefully worded to suggest that deceased actors had been troubled individuals who'd made tragic choices, never mentioning that studio doctors had provided the pills that made those choices possible. The narrative framework blamed victims while protecting systems, ensuring that nothing would change despite bodies accumulating at rates that should have prompted emergency intervention. Insurance companies began refusing to cover actors with known barbiturate dependencies, or charged premiums so high they were effectively denying coverage. This actuarial judgment based on pure financial calculation provided more honest assessment of barbiturate danger than any medical or regulatory statement, but it only affected whether people could get insurance, not whether they could get pills. Doctors continued prescribing without requiring patients to prove insurability, creating situations where people were considered too high risk to insure, but not too high risk to continue receiving medications that insurance companies knew were likely to kill them. Judy Garland's tolerance eventually reached limits that even her adapted metabolism couldn't sustain. By 1969, she was taking doses that seemed designed to eventually stop her heart through sheer chemical overload. Her body had survived impossible amounts for decades, but biological systems have breaking points that tolerance can delay but not eliminate. She was 47 years old and looked 70, her face showing the effects of decades of pharmaceutical assault that had aged her faster than time ever could. The woman who'd represented eternal youth in The Wizard of Oz had been destroyed by the very industry that made her famous, though nobody with power wanted to acknowledge that truth when convenient lies were available. Marilyn Monroe's relationship with barbiturates began in 1951 when a studio doctor prescribed Nembutal for insomnia, caused by the anxiety of being transformed from Norma Jean into a manufactured sexual fantasy. She was 25 and already suffering from the psychological strain of being treated as a product rather than a person, her body and face valued while her thoughts and feelings were considered irrelevant to her function. The pills worked immediately, providing 6 hours of dreamless unconsciousness that felt like mercy compared to lying awake replaying every moment of her inadequacy. Within months she needed them every night, the definition of need shifting from preference to physiological requirement that her body enforced through withdrawal symptoms when she tried to skip doses. Her collection of prescriptions grew throughout the 1950s as her fame increased and her mental state deteriorated under the pressure of being America's primary masturbation fantasy. She visited multiple doctors, none of whom communicated with each other or bothered to check whether she was accumulating dangerous quantities of the same medications under different brand names. Dr. Hyman Engelberg prescribed Nembutal. Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, prescribed chloral hydrate. Other physicians whose names appeared on pill bottles found in her home after her death prescribed Seconal, phenobarbital, and various other barbiturate formulations that were chemically similar enough to create compounding effects. She was taking upwards of 20 pills daily by 1960, mixing sedatives that should never have been combined, creating pharmaceutical interactions that no single doctor understood because no single doctor knew what all the others were prescribing. The studios encouraged her dependency because drugged Marilyn was more manageable than sober Marilyn, who had opinions and demanded respect that conflicted with her function as animated pornography. Fox executives knew she was taking massive doses of barbiturates and didn't care as long as she showed up for filming looking photogenic. When the pills made her too unreliable to work, they suspended her rather than addressing the addiction they'd enabled, punishing her for problems they'd helped create. The cycle was vicious. Anxiety about work led to more pills, pills led to worse performance led to more anxiety, which led to more pills until the spiral tightened into a noose. Her romantic relationships collapsed under the weight of her pharmaceutical dependency. Joe DiMaggio divorced her partly because he couldn't stand watching her destroy herself with pills while refusing to acknowledge she had a problem. Arthur Miller wrote The Misfits, partly as a way to process the experience of being married to someone whose personality changed based on what drugs she'd taken that day. She wasn't one person but several, each version dependent on her blood concentration of barbiturates. There was sober Marilyn who rarely appeared, slightly sedated Marilyn who could function in public, heavily drugged Marilyn who slurred her words and forgot conversations, and overdosed Marilyn, who'd be unconscious for 12 hours, requiring medical intervention. Her husbands were married to all these versions simultaneously, never knowing which one would appear. The automatism phenomenon affected her severely because her tolerance was so high that the dose needed for sleep was close to the dose that caused confusion and memory impairment. She'd take her pills at bedtime, enter a fugue state where she'd wander her house while technically unconscious, take more pills without remembering the first dose, and wake up 12 hours later with no memory of the night before. Friends who stayed with her reported finding her in the kitchen at 3 a.m. holding pill bottles and speaking nonsense, having taken multiple doses without awareness. The behaviour was terrifying to witness but impossible to prevent because she couldn't remember being told about it. The drugs destroying the cognitive function needed to protect herself from the drugs. By 1962, she was functionally unemployable despite being the most famous actress in the world. Fox fired her from Something's Got to Give after she'd shown up for only 12 of 32 scheduled shooting days, the absences caused by taking too many pills and being unable to wake up, or taking too few pills and being too anxious to leave her house. The movie had been designed specifically for her, built around her limitations and psychological needs, yet she still couldn't complete it because her barbiturate dependency had progressed beyond the point where adjustments and accommodations could compensate. The studio publicly blamed her unprofessionalism while privately acknowledging they'd helped create the addiction that was making her unprofessional. Her final months were a pharmaceutical nightmare documented through prescriptions and pharmacy records that would be examined obsessively after her death. She had standing prescriptions for Nembutal from Dr. Engelberg that allowed refills without examinations, essentially giving her unlimited access to drugs that were killing her. Dr. Greenson prescribed chloral hydrate, an older sedative that enhanced barbiturate effects in ways that were unpredictable and dangerous. She was mixing these medications with alcohol, creating combinations that pharmacologists would later calculate should have killed her weeks before she actually died. Her tolerance was extraordinary but had limits, and she was approaching them at accelerating speed. August 4th, 1962 started as an ordinary Saturday in Los Angeles, which meant Marilyn spent it alone in her Brentwood home taking pills and making phone calls that demonstrated her altered mental state. She spoke with multiple people throughout the day, her level of intoxication varying with each conversation as she took more pills and her blood concentration increased. Peter Lawford talked to her around 7:30 p.m. and later said she sounded strange. Her speech slurred in ways that suggested heavy sedation or the beginning of an overdose. He didn't call for help because she often sounded that way, and nobody knew when slurred speech indicated dangerous overdose versus her normal evening pharmaceutical state. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, claimed she saw light under Marilyn's bedroom door at midnight and found it unusual enough to call doctor. Greenson, who arrived around 3:30 a.m. and broke a window to get into the locked bedroom. They found her face down and naked on the bed, phone in hand, obviously dead for hours with rigor mortis already setting in. The scene was strange from the beginning. The locked door, the telephone, the position of her body suggesting she'd died while trying to call someone. Murray's timeline would change multiple times in subsequent interviews, raising questions about when Marilyn actually died and why there was such a delay before anyone called for help. The police arrived at 4:25 a.m. to find a death scene that had already been disturbed, with Murray washing sheets and Dr. Greenson having removed some pill bottles before calling authorities. The official timeline claimed Marilyn died around midnight, but body temperature and rigor mortis suggested death had occurred much earlier, possibly as early as 9 p.m. The delayed notification meant the crime scene, if it was a crime scene, had been contaminated for hours before professional investigation began. Nothing about the official story made sense to experienced detectives, but the case was politically sensitive in ways that discouraged aggressive investigation. The autopsy performed by Dr. Thomas Noguchi found massive levels of barbiturates in her blood and liver, 8 mg% of pentobarbital, and 4.5 mg% of chloral hydrate, concentrations that were indisputably lethal regardless of tolerance. Her stomach was nearly empty, which created a medical mystery because oral ingestion of that quantity of pills should have left residue that wasn't present. Noguchi noted this discrepancy but didn't emphasize it, allowing the official conclusion of oral overdose to stand despite physical evidence suggesting the drugs might have entered her system through other routes. The possibility of injection was mentioned then quietly dropped because it raised questions about who might have injected her. The death was ruled probable suicide within days, a conclusion that satisfied everyone who wanted the case closed quickly. The ruling was based on her history of suicide attempts, her psychological instability, and the finding of empty pill bottles near her bed. Nobody explained the missing pills from her stomach, the suspicious timeline, or why someone suicidal would die with a phone in her hand as if trying to call for help. The investigation was perfunctory and politically motivated, conducted by people who understood that certain truths would be more damaging than convenient lies. Whether she killed herself, accidentally overdosed, or was killed by someone else became less important than protecting powerful people connected to her death. Conspiracy theories emerged immediately because the official story had holes large enough to drive conspiracies through. She'd been involved with President Kennedy and his brother Robert, affairs that were known to intelligence agencies, organized crime, and others who might have had reasons to eliminate someone with dangerous knowledge about powerful men. The FBI had files on her because of suspected communist sympathies and her marriage to Arthur Miller, who was considered a security risk. Her death coincidentally removed someone who was becoming increasingly unstable and unpredictable while possessing information that could embarrass the presidency. The timing was convenient for people who benefited from her silence. The alternate theories range from plausible to absurd, that the Kennedys had her killed to prevent her from revealing their affairs, that the mafia killed her to embarrass the Kennedys, that the CIA killed her for reasons related to intelligence operations nobody understood. These theories were almost certainly wrong, but they persisted because the official story was demonstrably incomplete, and investigators who should have pursued obvious questions didn't. The most likely explanation remained accidental overdose caused by automatism, with Marilyn taking her usual bedtime dose, then taking more in a confused state until she'd consumed lethal amounts. This explanation required no conspiracies, just acknowledgement that barbiturates destroyed the cognitive function needed to use them safely. The strange elements of the death scene, the locked door, the phone, the timeline discrepancies, could be explained through Murray and Dr. Greenson panicking and contaminating the scene before calling police. They may have removed evidence of the massive pharmaceutical stockpile in her home to avoid questions about where all those pills came from and why her doctors had prescribed them. The cover-up wasn't about murder, but about medical negligence, doctors and staff trying to hide evidence of their role in maintaining the addiction that killed her. This explanation was less exciting than Kennedy assassinations, but more consistent with available evidence. Her death at 36 was ruled the accidental conclusion of a probable suicide, bureaucratic language that meant investigators couldn't prove intent but weren't willing to call it accidental given her history. The ruling satisfied nobody and convinced everyone that their particular theory was correct, whether that theory involved intelligence agencies, organized crime, or simple pharmaceutical tragedy. The ambiguity ensured Marilyn's death would be examined obsessively for decades, generating books, documentaries, and investigations that tried to find definitive answers in evidence that was incomplete, contaminated, and politically manipulated from the beginning. The immediate impact was massive media coverage that turned a human tragedy into entertainment spectacle. Newspapers ran front-page photographs of her body being removed from her home, Tabloids speculated about suicide notes and secret affairs, and magazines published memorial issues that celebrated her beauty while carefully avoiding mention of the pharmaceutical dependency that killed her. The coverage treated her death as mysterious rather than predictable, as if a woman taking massive doses of barbiturates dying from barbiturate overdose was somehow unexpected. The collective denial was comprehensive, allowing everyone to mourn while learning nothing. Her funeral drew crowds that demonstrated how thoroughly she'd been transformed from person into public property. Mourners who'd never met her weeping over a casket while photographers captured their grief for commercial purposes. Joe DiMaggio organised the funeral and banned Hollywood from attending, understanding that the industry had destroyed her and didn't deserve to perform grief at her burial. The exclusion was petty revenge, but also appropriate acknowledgement that Hollywood's relationship with Marilyn had been extractive and fatal, taking everything she had until there was nothing left but a body saturated with pills. The prescription bottles found in her home after her death revealed the scope of her pharmaceutical dependency. Bottles from multiple doctors, some empty, some full, representing hundreds of pills that she'd accumulated through legitimate prescriptions. The medication should have been controlled through a single prescribing physician who monitored total consumption, but the medical system allowed doctor shopping and multiple concurrent prescriptions without oversight. Her death demonstrated the consequences of this systematic failure, but the system didn't change because changing it would have required doctors admitting they'd been negligent and pharmaceutical companies accepting reduced profits. Marilyn Monroe's death became the defining moment of barbiturate awareness, despite thousands having died before her, because famous deaths matter more than anonymous ones in cultures that value celebrity over substance. Her face on magazine covers sold the message that barbiturates were dangerous more effectively than any medical journal article or public health campaign ever could. The irony was brutal. She'd spent her life being used by people who profited from her image, and her death was similarly exploited. Her tragedy converted into cautionary tale that warned of dangers everyone should have recognized decades earlier. Even in death, she wasn't allowed to be a person, only a symbol serving purposes she never chose. Marilyn Monroe's death in August 1962 detonated public awareness that had been building for years, but lacked a catalyst dramatic enough to overcome institutional denial. Congressional mailboxes filled with letters from citizens demanding investigation into prescription drug safety. Letters that couldn't be ignored because they came from voters angry about a specific death, rather than abstract statistics. Senator Estes Kefauver had been conducting hearings on pharmaceutical industry practices since 1959, focusing primarily on pricing and marketing, but Monroe's death gave him the political ammunition to expand into drug safety. The hearings reconvened in 1963 with new urgency, calling pharmaceutical executives and medical experts to explain how prescription medications were killing thousands of Americans annually, while doctors and drug companies insisted they were safe. The testimony revealed an industry that had spent decades prioritizing profit over patient safety, fighting any regulation that might reduce sales even when those sales were killing people. Pharmaceutical executives admitted under oath that they'd known about barbiturate addiction since the 1930s, but hadn't considered it their responsibility to warn doctors or patients, arguing that physicians should have been aware of risks from reading medical literature. The circular logic was perfect. They'd published research in obscure journals while simultaneously marketing barbiturates as safe in advertisements that reached every doctor in America, ensuring that commercial messages overwhelmed scientific warnings. Senator Kefauver's contempt was evident in his questioning, but contempt doesn't translate into legislation without political will that the pharmaceutical lobby was spending millions to prevent. Studies commissioned by the FDA in the wake of Monroe's death documented the scale of barbiturate addiction for the first time with rigorous methodology that couldn't be dismissed. Between 3 and 5 million Americans were physically dependent on barbiturates, requiring daily doses to avoid withdrawal symptoms that could kill them. Another 10 million were regular users who hadn't yet crossed into addiction, but were on trajectories that would get them there within months or years. The numbers suggested that prescription drug dependency affected more Americans than all illegal drug use combined, though nobody wanted to acknowledge this because it implicated doctors and pharmaceutical companies in creating the largest drug epidemic in American history. Emergency room data collected between 1963 and 1965 showed barbiturate overdoses had increased by 400% over the previous decade, with deaths rising proportionally. Hospitals in major cities were treating multiple barbiturate overdoses daily, overwhelming emergency departments that weren't equipped to handle the volume. The treatment was primitive and often unsuccessful. Gastric lavage to pump out unabsorbed drugs, activated charcoal if caught early enough, mechanical ventilation for patients whose breathing had slowed too much to sustain life. Many died despite aggressive intervention because the therapeutic window was so narrow that by the time symptoms were obvious, lethal levels were already being absorbed. Coroners from major cities testified about death rates that suggested systematic pharmaceutical failure rather than individual misuse. Los Angeles County had recorded 823 barbiturate deaths in 1964, up from 235 in 1955. New York City reported similar increases. Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco all showed exponential curves that would have prompted immediate regulatory action if the drugs had been distributed illegally rather than prescribed by physicians. The testimony made clear that barbiturates were killing more Americans annually than automobile accidents in some demographics, particularly middle-aged women who'd been prescribed these medications for anxiety and insomnia that were often symptoms of lives that needed social rather than pharmaceutical solutions. The pharmaceutical industry's response was coordinated and aggressive, deploying lobbying resources that dwarfed anything patient advocacy groups could muster. Eli Lilly, Abbott Laboratories and other manufacturers formed coalitions that argued increased regulation would deprive patients of necessary medications, turning the debate into a choice between access and safety, rather than acknowledging that the current medications were neither safe nor necessary in the quantities being prescribed. They funded sympathetic medical experts who testified that barbiturates were essential tools that were being blamed for problems caused by patient misuse, shifting responsibility from manufacturers and prescribers to users in ways that were technically accurate but practically deceptive. The AMA opposed aggressive regulation because restricting barbiturates meant restricting physician autonomy in ways that set precedents most doctors found threatening. Medical associations argued that prescription decisions should remain between doctors and patients without government interference, framing regulation as political overreach rather than public health necessity. This position protected physician authority while ensuring that doctors who were negligently prescribing barbiturates would face no consequences. The professional solidarity was impressive and deeply cynical, prioritizing guild interest over patient safety in ways that would have shocked people who still believed medical ethics meant something beyond protecting doctors' incomes. Senator Kefauver pushed for legislation that would have required pharmaceutical companies to prove drugs were safe before marketing them, shifted burden of proof from regulators to manufacturers, and created strict controls on addictive medications. The bill was radical for its time, proposing that companies should demonstrate safety rather than forcing the FDA to prove danger after drugs were already on the market killing people. The pharmaceutical lobby fought it with everything they had, spending millions on campaign contributions and media campaigns that portrayed regulation as anti-innovation and anti-patient. The effort worked. Congress passed a watered-down version in 1962 that improved labeling requirements but didn't fundamentally change the regulatory structure that had allowed barbiturates to become epidemic. The thalidomide tragedy in Europe, where a supposedly safe sedative caused birth defects in thousands of children, provided additional momentum for drug safety regulation that barbiturate deaths alone hadn't generated. American women had been spared because FDA officer Frances Kelsey had refused to approve thalidomide despite intense pharmaceutical pressure, but the near miss terrified legislators enough to overcome some of their industry deference. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 required proof of efficacy and safety before drug approval, though it grandfathered in existing medications like barbiturates that had been marketed for decades without rigorous testing. The reform was significant, but came too late for the millions already dependent on drugs that would have never been approved under the new standards. Barbiturates remained readily available through the 1960s, despite increased awareness of their dangers, because replacing them required alternatives that didn't exist yet in sufficient variety. Benzodiazepines had been introduced in the late 1950s, chlordiazepoxide, Libium, in 1960, and diazepam, Valium, in 1963, and were marketed as safer sedatives with lower addiction potential and wider therapeutic windows. The pharmaceutical industry positioned them as solutions to the barbiturate crisis, and doctors prescribed them eagerly to patients who needed sedation without the death risk. The switch was massive and rapid, with benzodiazepine prescriptions exploding through the 1960s as barbiturate prescriptions declined. Nobody seemed to notice or care that this was exactly the same pattern that had occurred with barbiturates 50 years earlier. New drugs marketed as safe replacements for dangerous old drugs, mass adoption without long-term safety data, reassurances that this time would be different. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 finally imposed federal restrictions on barbiturates, classifying them in Schedule 2 for short-acting varieties like pentobarbital, or Schedule 3 and 4 for longer-acting versions like phenobarbital. The classification required special prescriptions that couldn't be refilled without doctor examination, created record-keeping requirements for doctors and pharmacies, and imposed penalties for illegal distribution. The regulations were reasonable, but came after decades of epidemic use had created millions of dependent users who couldn't quit safely, and doctors who didn't know how to help them withdraw. The law addressed future problems while doing nothing for current addicts except making it slightly harder to get the drugs they were physiologically dependent on, which increased black market activity without reducing addiction. Judy Garland died on June 22, 1969, just before the regulatory structure changed, killed by the same barbiturate dependency that had been destroying her for 24 years. She was found dead in the bathroom of her London house, sitting on the toilet with lethal levels of barbiturates in her system, in a death that was ruled accidental but might have been suicide or automatism. The distinction was meaningless by that point in her addiction. She was 47 years old and had been trying to quit for decades without success, because quitting barbiturates after such extended use was medically dangerous and required supervised withdrawal that few facilities offered. Her death generated headlines and memorial tributes that celebrated her talent while mentioning her personal demons in language that avoided acknowledging Hollywood, and the medical establishment had created and maintained those demons for profit. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, from barbiturate intoxication combined with alcohol, found in a London hotel room after taking 9 Vesprax tablets that each contained multiple sedatives including secobarbital. The official inquest ruled accidental death caused by choking on vomit while unconscious from drug intoxication, though friends suspected suicide that couldn't be proven. He was 27 years old and had been using barbiturates recreationally for years, part of a rock culture that treated pharmaceutical sedatives as acceptable alternatives to, or combinations with illegal drugs. His death demonstrated that barbiturate dangers transcended prescription use. Street versions and recreational consumption were killing people as reliably as legitimate medical prescriptions, creating overlapping epidemics that served different populations but produced identical outcomes. Dinah Washington had died earlier, on December 14, 1963, from an accidental overdose of Seconal and alcohol at age 39, found in her Detroit home with barbiturate levels that suggested she'd taken pills in a confused state without remembering previous doses. She was a successful singer who'd been prescribed barbiturates for insomnia and had developed the automatism pattern that killed so many users, taking pills, entering fugue states, taking more pills, dying from accumulated doses she couldn't remember consuming. Her death received significant coverage in the black press but limited mainstream attention, suggesting that barbiturate deaths were newsworthy in proportion to victims' fame and race, rather than their frequency or preventability. The medical establishment began publishing honest assessments of barbiturate dangers in the early 1970s, as benzodiazepines replaced them in standard practice, allowing doctors to criticize drugs they were no longer prescribing without admitting their own culpability. Medical journals that had published glowing reviews of barbiturates for decades suddenly featured articles about addiction risks, narrow therapeutic windows, and dangerous withdrawal syndromes as if this information was newly discovered rather than deliberately ignored. The revisionism was comprehensive and shameless, with physicians who'd written thousands of barbiturate prescriptions now positioning themselves as experts on addiction who'd always known these drugs were dangerous. The rewriting of history protected professional reputations while ensuring that lessons learned from the barbiturate epidemic would be forgotten in time for the next pharmaceutical disaster. Treatment facilities for barbiturate addiction remained scarce through the 1970s because withdrawal required medical supervision that was expensive and few insurance plans covered. Dependent patients who wanted to quit faced months of gradual dose reduction to avoid seizures and death, a process that was medically complex and commercially unprofitable. Most addicts continued using because quitting was too dangerous to attempt without help that wasn't available. The medical system that had created their dependencies largely abandoned them, prescribing maintenance doses to prevent withdrawal death while offering no path to recovery. The cruelty was systematic. Doctors had made money creating addictions and now made money maintaining them, with patients trapped in dependencies that were more profitable to sustain than to cure. Pharmaceutical companies quietly discontinued many barbiturate formulations through the 1970s as benzodiazepines captured market share, though they never admitted their previous products had been dangerously defective. The drugs simply disappeared from formularies and marketing materials, replaced by newer sedatives that were promoted with identical promises of safety and efficacy. The industry had learned that admitting fault created legal liability, so drugs that had killed thousands were withdrawn from sale without acknowledgement of harm. The strategy worked. There were no major lawsuits or regulatory punishments, just a gradual shift to different drugs, while the bodies accumulated by barbiturates were buried and forgotten. By 1980, barbiturate prescriptions had declined by 90% from their 1960s peak, replaced almost entirely by benzodiazepines that doctors believed were safer despite limited long-term data supporting that belief. The transition was treated as medical progress rather than repetition of patterns that should have been recognized. The new drugs were marketed with the same reassurances that had accompanied barbiturates, prescribed with the same casual disregard for addiction potential, and adopted with the same enthusiasm that marked every previous pharmaceutical miracle. The benzodiazepine epidemic was already beginning, though nobody wanted to see it, because acknowledging it would have required admitting that the medical and pharmaceutical establishments had learned absolutely nothing from decades of barbiturate deaths, except how to market the next generation of addictive sedatives more effectively. Barbiturates never disappeared entirely despite their fall from mainstream medicine, finding refuge in specialized applications that exploited their efficiency at shutting down consciousness permanently. Veterinarians continued using pentobarbital for animal euthanasia because it provided quick, painless death that was more humane than alternatives and cheaper than newer drugs. The same medication that had put humans to sleep in the 1950s was still putting animals to sleep in the 2000s, the only difference being that veterinary doses were calculated to ensure death rather than risk revival. Neurologists still prescribed phenobarbital for seizure disorders when newer anticonvulsants failed, maintaining the one legitimate medical use where barbiturates' dangers were outweighed by their effectiveness at preventing epileptic death. The most grimly ironic use was in execution protocols where states adopted barbiturates for lethal injection after pharmaceutical companies stopped providing the previously used drugs. Pentobarbital became the preferred execution drug in the 2000s, with states stockpiling it from questionable sources when legitimate manufacturers refused to sell for capital punishment purposes. Prisoners were being killed with the same drug that had accidentally killed Marilyn Monroe, the circle completing itself in ways that demonstrated barbiturates had always been most reliable at causing death, regardless of whether that death was intended. The execution protocols used massive doses that caused unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes, proving that barbiturates had always been more effective as poison than medicine. Assisted suicide organizations adopted barbiturates as their preferred method because the drugs provided the peaceful death they'd originally been marketed to facilitate. Organizations like Dignitas in Switzerland and End of Life Washington used pentobarbital or secobarbital to help terminally ill patients end their lives, finally fulfilling the promise of sleep without waking that had been advertised in the 1950s. The use was humane and intentional rather than accidental, but it acknowledged what had been true all along. These drugs were extraordinarily efficient at ending consciousness permanently. The difference was consent and medical supervision, instead of confused late-night overdoses, though the chemical mechanism remained identical. The contemporary opioid epidemic mirrors the barbiturate crisis with precision that suggests humans learn nothing from pharmaceutical disasters except how to repeat them with different molecules. OxyContin was marketed in 1996 with promises of safe pain relief and low addiction potential, claims that were demonstrably false, but believed by doctors who'd somehow forgotten they'd heard identical promises about barbiturates. Purdue Pharma's aggressive marketing convinced physicians that opioid addiction was rare and manageable, repeating strategies that barbiturate manufacturers had perfected decades earlier. The death toll climbed through the 2000s and 2010s as prescription opioids created dependencies that transitioned to heroin and fentanyl, killing more Americans annually than barbiturates ever managed, but following patterns that were entirely predictable to anyone who remembered the 1950s and 1960s. The parallels are comprehensive and damning. Both drugs were marketed to doctors as safe and effective solutions to common problems. Pain for opioids, anxiety and insomnia for barbiturates. Both created physical dependencies that physicians initially dismissed as rare complications rather than inevitable consequences of regular use. Both generated enormous pharmaceutical profits that funded lobbying against regulation. Both resulted in millions of dependent patients who'd started with legitimate prescriptions and ended up addicted to drugs they couldn't quit safely. The medical establishment's response was nearly identical. Initial denial, gradual acknowledgement, eventual replacement with supposedly safer alternatives that would create their own epidemics. The opioid crisis wasn't a new problem, but a rerun with updated chemistry. Benzodiazepines followed barbiturates into mass addiction exactly as predicted by people who'd been ignored the first time. Valium became the most prescribed drug in America by 1978, with doctors writing prescriptions for anxiety and insomnia using the same casual approach that had created the barbiturate epidemic. The drugs were safer in overdose but created dependencies that were just as severe and withdrawals that were nearly as dangerous. By the 1990s, millions of Americans were dependent on benzodiazepines, unable to quit without medical supervision and experiencing rebound anxiety that was worse than their original symptoms. The pattern had repeated perfectly, proving that pharmaceutical companies and medical establishments will always choose profitable prescribing patterns over patient safety when given the opportunity. The current addiction crisis is polysubstance in ways that would have been familiar to 1960s users who mixed barbiturates with alcohol and amphetamines. Modern users combine opioids with benzodiazepines and alcohol, creating interactions that are more lethal than any single drug. Emergency rooms see regular deaths from combinations that each component's prescribing doctor didn't know about, because patients see multiple physicians who don't communicate, and pharmacies don't flag dangerous combinations effectively. The fragmented healthcare system ensures that mistakes made in the 1950s continue being made in the 2020s, with bodies accumulating at rates that suggest systematic failure rather than individual tragedy. Sleeping pills in the 2020s are primarily Z drugs like Ambien, marketed as safer alternatives to benzodiazepines with lower addiction potential. The marketing materials sound identical to 1950s barbiturate advertisements, promising restful sleep without dependency concerns. Users report the same automatism behaviors that killed barbiturate users, taking pills, entering fugue states, performing complex activities without memory, occasionally dying from additional doses taken while unconscious. The phenomenon has been rebranded as complex sleep behaviors rather than drug-induced cognitive impairment, but the underlying problem is identical. Sedatives that impair the judgment needed to use them safely will always cause some users to take dangerous doses without intending to. The cultural impact of barbiturates extends beyond their direct casualties into changing how Americans think about pharmaceutical solutions to human problems. The 1950s normalized the idea that emotional distress required chemical management rather than social or psychological intervention, establishing patterns that dominate contemporary healthcare. Anxiety isn't addressed through therapy or life changes, but through pills that dampen symptoms while leaving underlying causes untouched. Insomnia is treated with drugs rather than sleep hygiene, or addressing the stressors preventing natural rest. The medicalization of normal human experiences that barbiturates began has accelerated through subsequent decades until every variation from pharmaceutical industry-defined normalcy becomes a disorder requiring chemical correction. The gender dynamics that made women the primary targets of barbiturate marketing continue with every new class of psychoactive drugs. Women receive prescriptions for antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and sleep aids at dramatically higher rates than men, perpetuating the assumption that female emotional experiences are pathological conditions requiring pharmaceutical management. The marketing has become more sophisticated, but the underlying message remains identical to 1950s advertisements showing housewives needing pills to cope with domestic life. Women's dissatisfaction with limited options is treated as a medical problem rather than social one. The pills still serve the same function they did 70 years ago, dampening awareness of restricted lives while ensuring that women remain functional enough to perform expected roles without becoming too conscious of their circumstances. The Hollywood system that fed Judy Garland amphetamines and barbiturates until she died has evolved but not improved. Child actors still work impossible schedules that interfere with normal development. Studio doctors still prescribe medications to manage young performers who show signs of stress or rebellion. The chemistry has changed, Adderall instead of Benzedrine, Xanax instead of Seconal, but the exploitation remains identical. Disney and Nickelodeon stars follow trajectories that parallel Garland's, starting as functioning child performers and ending as adults with substance dependencies and psychological damage that everyone attributes to personal weakness rather than systematic abuse. The pattern repeats because the industry structure that created it remains profitable and largely unregulated. The conspiracy theories surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death have overshadowed the mundane reality that prescription drugs prescribed by legitimate doctors killed her. The focus on possible Kennedy involvement or mafia connections makes her death mysterious rather than representative of pharmaceutical dangers that killed thousands of less famous people. This focus serves everyone except truth. It protects doctors who prescribe dangerous quantities of barbiturates, pharmaceutical companies that manufactured those drugs, and the medical system that enabled doctor shopping and multiple concurrent prescriptions. Treating Monroe's death as unique prevents learning from it, ensuring that the patterns that killed her continue killing people whose deaths don't generate conspiracy theories or media fascination. The forgotten victims outnumber the famous ones by orders of magnitude. For every Marilyn Monroe or Judy Garland whose barbiturate death made headlines, 1,000 housewives, veterans and working people died from the same drugs and got 2 paragraphs in local obituaries that listed natural causes or heart failure, without mentioning the pills that cause those failures. The disparity in attention reflects cultural values that treat celebrity deaths as tragedies worth examining, while considering regular deaths as statistical inevitabilities. The famous deaths at least generated temporary awareness, but the anonymous deaths that dwarfed them in number disappeared without acknowledgement or investigation, their lessons unlearned because their stories were never told. Pharmaceutical companies never paid meaningful compensation to families destroyed by barbiturate addiction, because proving that legally prescribed medications used as directed caused harm was nearly impossible under product liability laws of the era. The few lawsuits that were filed typically settled for amounts that were rounding errors in pharmaceutical profits, with confidentiality agreements preventing public awareness of settlements. The companies that manufactured and marketed barbiturates for decades, despite knowing about addiction risks, faced no criminal prosecution, no regulatory punishment that significantly impacted their operations, and no requirement to fund treatment for the addictions they'd created. The precedent was clear. Pharmaceutical companies could create mass addiction through negligent marketing and prescribing practices without legal consequences, as long as doctors wrote the prescriptions. The medical profession never conducted a reckoning over its role in creating the barbiturate epidemic. Individual doctors who'd written thousands of negligent prescriptions faced no disciplinary action from medical boards that were more interested in protecting physician autonomy than patient safety. The AMA never apologized for opposing regulation that would have saved lives, and medical schools didn't substantially change how they taught prescribing practices. The profession moved on to prescribing benzodiazepines and then opioids, without incorporating lessons from the barbiturate era, because acknowledging those lessons would have required admitting that doctors had been systematically harming patients for profit. Professional pride prevented honest evaluation, ensuring that mistakes would repeat with the next generation of addictive medications. The question of how many people barbiturates killed will never be answered definitively, because death certificates from the peak years rarely listed drugs as causes when other explanations were available. A person who took barbiturates for years and died of a liver failure had their death attributed to the organ failure rather than the drugs that caused it. Suicide victims who used barbiturates were counted as suicides without barbiturates being noted as the method. The accounting was deliberately imprecise, allowing the scope of the disaster to remain vague and debatable rather than concrete and damning. Conservative estimates suggest 50,000 Americans died directly from barbiturate overdoses between 1950 and 1970, with hundreds of thousands more dying from complications of long-term use that weren't directly attributed to the drugs. The broader impact on American culture is impossible to quantify but undeniable. Barbiturates normalized pharmaceutical approaches to human problems that would have been addressed through social support, psychological treatment, or simple acceptance in previous eras. The drugs established precedents for chemical management of consciousness that accelerated through subsequent decades as new medications were developed and marketed. The idea that pills could fix human problems became so culturally embedded that questioning it marked someone as naive or anti-science, even when the pills were creating worse problems than they solved. The barbiturate era didn't end when prescribing declined. It evolved into contemporary pharmaceutical culture that treats chemical intervention as first response to any deviation from medicated normalcy. The final irony is that barbiturates were essentially correct advertising for dangerous products. They promised peaceful sleep and delivered permanent sleep. They promised to solve anxiety and solved it by ending consciousness. They promised relief from human suffering and provided relief by stopping human existence. The tragedy wasn't that they failed to work as advertised, but that they worked exactly as advertised when taken in sufficient doses, and the line between sufficient and excessive was so narrow that crossing it was inevitable for anyone who used them regularly. The pills kept their promises in the most literal and fatal way possible, demonstrating that sometimes the most dangerous products are the ones that work exactly as intended.